Maisel, and I have been a social worker in public child welfare, also known as child protection, for over a decade. And I've worked in a couple of counties in California, and I'm a trainer and coach of social workers in child protection now, and I train and coach in a larger region throughout the California, like San Francisco Bay Area. So I worked at a place in Oakland called Thunder Road before I decided to become a social worker. And Thunder Road is a group home that is for teenagers who are struggling with alcohol or drug abuse. And so they have had such serious consequences with their substance use that they need to go into inpatient drug treatment. And so the work that I was doing there was with young men and their families and dealing with some of the family dynamics that were going on. So it was kind of like a social worker boot camp in a way. And I had a supervisor who suggested that if I was ever going to go to grad school, that I should look into Masters of Social Work programs because they would provide a lot more opportunity and flexibility. So I researched it and discovered that through most MSW programs at least in California, if you want to go into public child welfare, there's actually a stipend that you can apply for. And so that kind of then led to my whole child protective services journey.
Okay,
When I was first getting started, my primary assignment was in what we call emergency response, which is investigations about whether abuse or neglect occurred. And so my job was to go and talk with children, talk with their parents, talk with siblings, anybody else that would talk with us, so that we could kind of try to get a picture of what was going on in the home and determine whether children were safe. And when we determined that children weren't safe because they were either being abused or neglected, and there was no way to plan with the family and the network around the child to engage in a safety plan, then my job was to remove kids and to place them outside of the home. Our goals in child welfare these days are to do whatever we can to keep kids safe at home. And our job is to work with relatives and people who are known to the child if the child has to leave the home. But in lots of cases, we're not able to make that assessment of the relatives who would be willing to take the child. Sometimes we're not able to do that quickly. And so I remember there was one boy that I removed. Actually, I think I was helping out a colleague. I think she had been the one to do the investigation. And so I picked up this kiddo. It was in a county that had a 24-hour, what they call receiving center. And so sometimes when kids are removed, they're taken to this building that has, rooms and beds and pajamas and toothbrushes and Pop-Tarts and things like that. But it's not a home.
Yeah.
And so it's a temporary place for them to just stay and be comfortable, take a bath, get some jammies on, and stay until we can find a place for them to go. And so I remember picking this kiddo up from that receiving center and then taking him to the identified foster home where he would be staying that night on an emergency basis. And he didn't know the people there, and he didn't know me. And we drove, I think the drive was maybe 45 minutes or so to get him to his house where he was going to stay the night. And when we got out of the car, he didn't want to get out. He had just met me, but he didn't want to leave me because he'd already had, he'd been removed from his grandma earlier that day. He'd been, taken by somebody that he had just met to a place where he didn't know anybody, picked up by somebody he didn't know, and taken to another house where he didn't know anybody. That's a lot for a 10-year-old to experience in less than 24 hours. So because so much in his world had changed so quickly, he kind of just latched on and didn't want to let go. So I was ultimately able to get him out of the car and get him into the home and try to get him situated and try to talk with the foster caregiver who would be taking care of him. And when we finally got him all situated into the room where he was going to stay, he offered to show me why he had been brought into foster care. And I said, okay. And so he turned around and he pulled down his pants and he showed me his behind, and there were just bruises all over his bottom. I was surprised that he was even able to sit down. So that kid, like I haven't seen that kid in, I don't know, I only saw him that one time. And it must have been 9 or 10 years ago that I saw him, but that's the kind of thing that you just remember.
Wow. Wait, how old was he again?
He was about 10.
10. So
Yeah.
he's like around like 19 now. Oh, he's like around our
Yeah.
age.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he would be a young adult now.
So like as like a social worker, has it ever affected you personally? Like it made you like, like sad, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. There was another case more recently where there was a girl who was almost 18. She was about 6 weeks away from her 18th birthday. And she was going to a special day class because she was really developmentally delayed. She had this really serious intellectual disability. And so she was at a school that was going to allow her to remain in that program as a student until I think 21 or 25, something like that. So she wasn't on the regular sort of graduation diploma track. She was on a different track. And her speech was really impaired. She didn't talk a lot. She didn't have a lot of what we call verbal expression skills. And so, but she had, the aide who helped her in the bathroom had seen some bruising up and down her back. So a report was made, and I went out to investigate, and the resource officer at that school had already attempted to talk to her, and she didn't tell him anything. She didn't show him any of the marks, and so he was sort of like, well, there's nothing going on, so we need to take her back home. So I went to talk to her to say, it sounds like you've talked to a couple of people, and I'm here to take you home. And her eyes got really big, and she was like, no, don't take me home. And so she showed me the marks on her back, and she had yardstick marks all up and down her back. So fast forward, we go to the home, we meet with her guardian, who's her grandma. Guardian says, she gets really destructive. She'll like pull the kitchen apart. She'll like take the cabinets off. When she gets mad, she just has these temper tantrums, and I can't really control her. And so I use my magic stick, which was this big yardstick, to basically like stop this girl's tantrums. And they didn't really have any like family support nearby. They had moved here from out of state. And so they didn't really have folks in their, what we call their network, to be able to come in and help the grandma and provide some, like de-escalation strategies or anything like that. There was really nothing grandma did when this girl got out of control except hit her with this stick. So I was like, I don't think it's really very safe. So a plan was made for that night, and she actually ended up going to the hospital for that night. And then the next day I had a meeting with my leadership team to ask them, what are we gonna do? I was really somebody who didn't want to remove kids if I could help it. But this girl, I didn't really see any other options. I didn't think it was safe for her to stay at home. And like I said, she was about 6 weeks away from her 18th birthday. And so the county that I worked for made the decision that we would get involved with the family, but we would offer a voluntary program with the girl staying in the home, and the girl wouldn't be removed. And that was a decision that I just felt wasn't good or right. I felt that there were, the county was making a decision not based on the best interest of the child, but based on other interests. And that really bothered me. I mean, sometimes social workers are put in situations where ultimately it's the jurisdiction who has the final say, and your supervisor, your manager, your county leadership team, or your state leadership team is gonna say, this is the direction we're going, and sometimes that doesn't feel like the right decision. So I think like that was one of the experiences that really stood out in my mind and still stands out in my mind as being a really tough decision for me to have to carry out, just because I just felt so differently, and no matter how much I advocated, I wasn't able to get done what I thought was the right thing for the family.
I see. So if you had the power to, what would you have done instead for the child?
Yeah, so I would have wanted to remove the child and to try to get some services in place and work with the family to create a plan where the grandma who was the guardian would have additional skills and strategies that she could use when this girl was behaving in ways that were in fact dangerous. I mean, if she's tearing up the kitchen, if she's pulling cabinets off the walls, that's dangerous. So I would have wanted for us to have had the court involved to oversee and to monitor what was going on, and to really sort of require that the guardian get better skills to be able to handle this girl's behaviors. One of the families that I worked with, there was a sibling set of 3 girls, and so this would have been again over a decade ago, so they're probably all adults now. But this sibling set of 3 girls, the oldest girl was in middle school, and she had been sexually abused by her father, and the mother didn't believe the girl's disclosure, didn't believe that that had happened. And so the girl ended up having to testify against the father with both parents present in court, which was a huge burden for, you know, a girl who's maybe 12, 13, 14 at the time, to just sort of feel alone and to have to go into detail about, you know, her violation and things that her dad had done that were probably embarrassing to her or she didn't feel comfortable talking about. Not only did she have to talk about it publicly, but she had to talk about it in front of a judge and attorneys and, you know, people that, you know, like the court reporter. And so it was a lot of work with her. I worked with her on an ongoing basis for about 6 or 8 months. And so it was a lot of work of, you know, just sort of letting her know that there were people who believed her and that she was brave and had done the right thing and telling the truth. But it made relationships with her and her siblings difficult because her siblings hadn't been abused, so they were removed from home and they didn't really understand why. There's lots of secrets, you know, like it's not okay to talk about it, both like within the foster home and also just sort of like in visits. You can't really talk about it. I don't think there was any therapy set up at that time that allowed her to really talk about it. So it's really complicated when there's a sibling group and one child is abused and the others are not. Sometimes the child who's abused is the one who's removed, and then that kid is punished or quote unquote punished for telling the truth. Sometimes all the kids are removed and some of the siblings don't know why. So it's really tricky, particularly in our society where there are so many taboos in terms of talking about sex and you know, having it be something that is openly discussed is not something that we tend to do. And particularly this family's cultural lens was one where sex was like not at all a topic of conversation. You just don't talk about it. You sort of pretend that it just never happens. And so to have something like that sort of explode in the middle of a family is really, really hard.
Are there any certain cases that stands out to you that you still remember to this day when it comes to like neglect?
You know, neglect is such an interesting category of abuse because the vast majority of children that we come in contact with are alleged victims of neglect. And so neglect can take all sorts of forms. Parents aren't supervising children because they're high or you know, drunk on alcohol or mentally ill and not paying attention. Sometimes it has to do with like medical or dental neglect. I remember investigating one family who was experiencing poverty and a lot of housing instability. They were, I think they were in the process of being evicted, and the reason that the kids came to our attention is because one of the children, a little boy, I think he was probably about 1st or 2nd grade, his teeth were just visibly rotting. You could see that they were like, you know, misshapen from poor hygiene and from cavities that weren't being treated. So we had, I think a public health nurse came out with me and took a look at his pictures of his teeth and said, oh yeah, you can see the root, you know, like something you're not supposed to see, right? And that family was, because of their housing instability, we just I don't know that there was much that we could do because I think we may have lost contact with them. Sometimes neglect looks like just unsanitary, unhealthful living conditions with just, dishes piled up in the sink and rotting food. And I investigated, actually, I wasn't the investigator, I was a social worker that took the case from the investigating social worker. And this family had just so much debris all over their house. They had probably 1.5 or 2 feet of just stuff covering their floor. The grandparents who took these kids in after they were removed, they told me later that they used to laugh about the little boy who was about 2 at the time they were removed, for like picking his feet up really high when he walked. And they laughed and, oh, he's like a little horse. But they said after they saw the pictures of the home, they realized that that's how he had learned to walk, was by picking his feet up really high to crawl over piles of debris. So our job with neglect is to try to figure out why it's happening, not just clean up the home, not just get the kid to the doctor or the dentist, not just make sure that you're not under the influence so you can provide supervision. The key with neglect is, why is it happening, so that we can really set up goals so that parents can do something differently. Whether that's making sure that they've got more people that they're calling on to come over and help, whether it's that they need to treat depression so that they can, make sure that their house is clean enough that their children aren't going to get sick. And sometimes it's just issues of poverty, like families are living in housing that's controlled by slumlords who don't take care of rodent problems or bug problems. So sometimes it's just sort of factors beyond the family's control that have gotten so bad that it's just not healthful or safe for the kids to live there, but sometimes it's really not their fault. So we try to do what we can to make sure that parents aren't punished for things that are outside of their control, but fix things that create danger to kids.
Okay, and so like when kids are taken into foster care, do you know like any kids who like suffered more being into foster care rather than like with their abusers?
Yeah. So I contributed to a book that came out last fall, and one of the kids that I wrote about, in the book I call him Parker. He was 4 years old when he was removed. He was located in a home that belonged to the mom's friend, that was condemned by the city. There was no electricity. They were routing cords from a neighbor. There was no water. They were routing in hoses. The floorboards, the police wouldn't let me and the intern who was shadowing me, they wouldn't let us walk into the kitchen because they sort of bounced up and down and said, look, the floorboards are about to give way, so don't come in here. They wouldn't let us go in the backyard, which was like a trash heap, basically. So the home that they were in was just uninhabitable and was red tagged and condemned by the city, and we couldn't get in touch with Parker's mom. And so we removed him, and again, Parker's the name that I use for him in the book. It's not his real name. And over the course of the years that his mom tried to reunify with him, I wasn't working with him that whole time. But we knew of this mom and we knew of this kid. And one of the things that happened to him was that while in foster care, he was sexually abused. And to our knowledge, he had not been sexually abused prior to him going into care. So that is one of the stories that I know about where very, very clearly children were hurt more in foster care than what their parents had done to them. All that being said, his mom was given services and was given opportunities to try to get her life back together so that she could reunify with him. And so it's just a tricky situation because, Parker had an alleged dad, and then turned out that wasn't really his dad. And so then we did more searching for his family, and it was just really hard to try to locate folks who would be able to take care of him long term. within his family system because his mom had burned so many bridges. And as far as I know, he remains in foster care today.
Oh, really?
And this would have been about 8 years ago that this happened. So he'd be about 12, 13, 14 years old.
Wow.
And as far as I know, he's still in foster care.
It's a long time.
Yeah, it's too long. It's something that we are really trying to move away from. But there are lots of barriers.
Foster kids like experience trauma. Do foster parents experience like some sort of like hardship too?
They do. Foster parents experience lots of hardship. We have lots of requirements as part of the child's case plan. So the child usually will have to get to visits at a minimum of once a week. And if the foster caregivers live at a great distance to where the visits happen, like that could be hours of transportation, we require that foster children and youth participate in other kinds of services like therapeutic services. Maybe that's individual counseling or some sort of social skills group or something like that. That also requires transportation. So foster caregivers, and then we also, our hope is always that foster caregivers and the natural parents of children in the system will develop some sort of relationship, that they'll be available to have the kid make phone calls to family and visit with siblings, and maybe even visit with grandparents. And so all of those require transportation on the part of the foster caregiver. We also it's really important to us over the last decade to really pay attention to how much school disruption foster kids are experiencing. And so if the family is close enough to their school of origin, we really encourage the foster caregivers to take the child back to their school of origin. And that too can be a struggle for a foster caregiver who might have multiple foster children living in their home. So, you think about one or a sibling set where it's all kind of the same, but if you've got 3 or 4 or 5, then you've got multiple places every week where you're trying to get all these kids to. So it's a lot to take on. Is it more painful for children to be dumped by their parents, or is it more painful for children to be removed by us? That's such an interesting question. My opinion is that regardless of the circumstances, some kids will view being removed from their home as a blessing, and some kids will view it as a curse. And there's a whole bunch of factors that would go into why that is. All kids who are removed from home feel like they're not wanted, whether or not we removed them or they were, dropped off. All children in foster care to a certain extent feel unwanted. And so, the trauma can really be offset by the number of resiliency factors that surround the young person. So, are they able to make a sense of meaning out of the events? Are they able to maintain connections with an adult who cares about them and is committed to their well-being? Do they have a strong sense of who they are as people that can help them to remain resilient in the face of obstacles? So a lot of those resiliency factors play a role in whether or not kids end up finding it traumatic or beneficial. Foster youth, kids who are in out-of-home care, they're just youth. They're just kids, just like anybody else, just like anybody you know. They did not do anything to make the circumstances that they're living in. Nothing that happened to them was their fault. And most of them, for the most part, really would give anything to be reunified with family, to be together as a household, and no matter what their parents have done to them, they still have love for their parents, and their parents, even if they're never able to put their lives back together to reunify with them, still love their kids. So it's not a lack of love. It's not the result of being a bad person. It's the result of unfortunate circumstances that there's a bunch of people who are trying to help. But foster youth and foster children experience a lot of stigma for their status as foster youth, and the more awareness that that teens can have around this issue, I think the kinder and more compassionate they can be.